Hello, this is a recording of overview of Oregon's Building Performance Standard. This was delivered live on July 9th to Strategic Energy Management participants under the Energy Trust of Oregon. And this is a recording without participants joining us. So welcome, and your delivery team presenting today is Grace Callahan and myself, Kevin Fish, both energy coaches with the Energy Trust of Oregon. Our objectives for today is, I mentioned we're doing an overview. We're going to explore from a high level what the breadth and depth of the Oregon Building Performance Standard is. We're going to look at key dates and compliance requirements. We're going to give you some resources, refer you to some resources, and give you information that can help you to take your next steps. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace to get us rolling.
Thanks, Kevin. Excited to be reviewing this content in a recorded format for everyone today. To begin, we're going to kick things off with some background and definitions for folks. So benchmarking and building performance standards are terms used to describe policies that mandate the measurement and/or adjustment of energy use in existing buildings. These types of policies have been popping up around the country as states and jurisdictions try to find ways to address energy use in their existing buildings. Benchmarking specifically refers to a policy that requires buildings to report their energy use, typically using something like Energy Star Portfolio Manager to do so. Building performance standards then set a target, usually an EUI or energy use intensity or a carbon target that the buildings then have to actually meet by reducing their energy use or carbon emissions. You can think of building performance standards as a type of energy code for specific buildings, and benchmarking is often a precursor to that building performance standard because it's hard to establish a BPS without existing building energy use data. That said, if sufficient energy use data is available, a building performance standard can be passed without a benchmarking policy first. As you'll see on this slide, building performance standard policies are fairly new to our country. While they do exist, most are at a more city or local jurisdiction level. But Oregon is one of the first 4 states to actually pass a statewide building performance standard. Our neighbors up north in Washington were the first passing their law in 2019. So let's talk about the specifics of Oregon's building performance standard. In 2023, House Bill 3409 was passed, which included language for the new building performance standard here. The objective of the building performance standards are to reduce emissions through requiring buildings to meet energy targets. The bill stipulated that targets must be weather normalized and that targets must be equal to or higher than the average EUI or energy use intensity for that building type. The bill also included funding for early compliance incentives, which we'll cover in a bit. There are a lot of similarities within the bill and standard to the Washington state policy, but they are not identical. After the bill was passed, ODO, or the Oregon Department of Energy, was directed to finalize the rules for this building performance standard. They did this through a stakeholder engagement process last year, concluding in 2024. And during that process, ASHRAE 100 was reviewed line by line and amended to meet the needs of our state specifically. Many of these amendments made were modeled after the Washington state rules, and this process also included the development of energy targets or EUI targets that certain buildings will have to meet. The resulting document was published early this year and will serve as the rule book for buildings covered by the standard, which you can see pictured on the right side of this slide. You may hear this document referred to as the BPS, but that term may also be used to describe House Bill 3409 or the ODO or Oregon Department of Energy program that's administering these rules now. The bill also stipulates that Energy Star Portfolio Manager will be the software used to calculate and report a building's energy use. Therefore, all covered buildings will be required to make an Energy Star Portfolio Manager account and upload their data. In addition, there are several forms that will need to be filled out and submitted electronically. The Oregon Department of Energy is actively working on a compliance portal that will serve this purpose. Buildings may also meet an exemption for which they will need to apply also through the portal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the webinar. Okay, so let's get into the definitions of covered buildings and tiers. There are two tiers of buildings covered by the standard. Tier 1 buildings have the most requirements, and Tier 2 buildings have the least. Let's talk about how those are defined on this next slide. So starting with Tier 2, Tier 2 buildings are buildings that are equal to or over 35,000 square feet and are in the multifamily residential, hospital, schools, dormitories, or university buildings category. But this also refers to other non-residential buildings, including hotels and motels, that are between 20,000 and 35,000 square feet. And that square footage threshold is excluding parking garages and parking spaces. Tier 1 buildings then fall into that non-residential category, so excluding hospitals, schools, dormitories, and university buildings, but that are over 35,000 square feet. So that Tier 2 area is from 20,000 to 35,000 square feet. All buildings over 35,000 square feet that don't meet that special Tier 2 facility type are then Tier 1 buildings. The compliance deadline for these buildings depends on the size of the building, with the largest buildings needing to comply first in June of 2028 and the smallest in June of 2030. If you're still unsure which tier your building falls within, or you prefer to use another visual, you can use this flow chart. First, determine the building type and then compare the square footage. That'll place you in one of these three buckets. So feel free to use that tool if you prefer. Okay, before I toss it over to Kevin, I'm going to do a little knowledge check, see if he was paying attention. Kevin, what did you learn from this section?
What did I learn? I learned that Oregon started from scratch on developing these policies. Is that right?
No, that's wrong, Kevin. So actually, Oregon used ASHRAE 100 as their base document to inform how they would develop this policy, which is the same method that our neighbors in Washington actually used to develop their policy too. So it was not from scratch. There's a lot of thought and intention that went into developing that standard that helped to inform Oregon's development.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's move on to comparing Oregon BPS to others.
Okay, so Oregon, as Grace mentioned, was not the first to come up with a building performance standard. There's others, and there's other similar ordinances. So Washington's, you see the C before BPS. They refer to theirs as the Clean Building Performance Standard. And there's a number of differences, although they're quite similar. For Tier 2 buildings in Washington, they have requirements to document an operations and maintenance plan and an energy management plan, whereas Tier 2 in Oregon does not have that requirement. Oregon has the Tier 2 categories of hospitals, dormitories, schools, universities that Grace mentioned. Whereas Washington only has the difference between tiers based on square footage. So those are two of the primary ones, and then there's some other differences. Another ordinance is, well, Energy Star. Grace mentioned that we use Energy Star Portfolio Manager in Oregon for complying with the building performance standards. Some of you who are familiar with Energy Star, the Energy Star program, your building may be Energy Star certified, meaning that it's in the top 25 percentile of similar use buildings in terms of energy. So there's a relationship here, but not a direct one. Just because you're Energy Star certified does not mean that you qualify for Oregon Building Performance Standard. In Portland, there's an ordinance for reporting energy for buildings over, I think it's 20,000 square feet. So that requires benchmarking or reporting of energy use, but you don't have to meet an energy target like you do for the statewide building performance standard. Okay, Grace also mentioned exemptions. Let's look at some of the categories for exemption. And here, compliance by exemption, you still do have to apply for exemption. So you comply by exemption. So here's some of the categories. If you don't have a certificate of occupancy, I think it's 12 months before the compliance deadline, then you are eligible to apply. If you don't have sufficient physical occupancy in the building, that's another category. Unconditioned, unheated spaces. The exact numbers are in the building performance standard itself as to the percentage of space, but if you don't have a sufficient amount of the building that is conditioned and heated, you can apply. For manufacturing and industrial, if more than 50% of the facility is manufacturing classification, then you can apply. If the building is used for agricultural purposes, and there's not a stipulation there on what percent of it, I think they figure if it's agricultural, it's agricultural. We don't have a whole lot of mixed use in that area, I'm guessing, is the thinking there. And then finally, financial hardship. And there's a number of specific cases of financial hardship in the standard, things that would qualify under this category. All right, and then in order to comply by exemption, you can't do it right at the time of the deadline. You've got to do it at least 180 days before the compliance deadline. So keep that in mind. Let's look at the requirements for the main requirements for Tier 2 and Tier 1 buildings. We're going to start with Tier 2 buildings. And the first one, identify a qualified energy manager. So we'll talk a little bit more later in this presentation about what that is, what the qualifications and responsibilities are. But at this point, just know that you have to select somebody with some qualifications called the qualified energy manager. You have to report your energy use intensity via Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Calculate the EUIT, and that's one of the tasks for the qualified energy manager, is to figure out what your target or threshold energy use is that you want to be under, and then submit the forms via what will be an online portal. Okay, for Tier 1, instead of the qualified energy manager, it's a person that needs to have a little more in terms of qualifications and is going to be responsible to do a little bit more work. It's called a qualified person. And then similar to Tier 2, you need to report your energy use intensity for the building using Energy Star Portfolio Manager. In this case, the qualified person will determine what your energy use intensity target or threshold is. And then down at the bottom, just like for Tier 2, you'll use the online portal to submit the appropriate forms. The additional requirements that Tier 1 has over Tier 2 is you have to document an operations and maintenance program that meets certain criteria. So hopefully, you folks already have something in place that largely meets this requirement. You may need to add a few features and then document it. And then what's going to be new for almost everyone is to develop an energy and emissions management plan, the details of which are spelled out in the standard. And in a later webinar, we'll go through those requirements. And then number 6, you either have your energy use beneath that target or threshold, or you need to have an energy audit performed by a person with certain qualifications, and then execute energy efficiency measures that meet a certain cost-effective criteria that will help reduce your energy. Okay, so energy and emissions management plan. we're going to just very quickly show you what the requirements are here without going into any depth. A subsequent webinar will go into a little more depth on this. So there's a number of components. Some of them will be relatively quick and easy to do. Some of them will take more thought, time, and intentionality. For the O&M program, at a high level, the content, you got to have some objectives and inventory. You have to have a plan that has those subpoints to it. The timing of this is something to pay particular attention to. First of all, you're supposed to review it and update it periodically. No surprise there. But down at the bottom, this is to be in place 12 months prior to your compliance date. So another reason to not wait, to think that you can just wait until your actual compliance date and submit your information to be done with it. This is something that has to be done 12 months prior. Tier 1 investment criteria and conditional compliance. So if your building doesn't have a energy use intensity target in the standard, there's a few activity types of buildings that don't. Or, and this is the more prevalent reason that you would do this, is if your energy use intensity, if you don't have it below the target, it's actually above the target, then you're going to need to have an energy audit done. That will be performed by somebody termed a qualified energy auditor. More on that shortly. You'll implement the cost-effective energy efficiency measures. And then you can either apply for compliance or there's a conditional compliance path, and some measurement and verification will be required for certain subpaths, I will say. Penalties for non-compliance. So for tier 1, the maximum penalty is $5,000 plus $1 per square foot per year. So if you have a relatively large building, you can do the math, it'll add up. It's not an inconsequential amount. For tier 2, no penalty for non-compliance. And with that, I think that's the end of the section. So Grace, what did you learn there?
Let's see. My takeaway is that there are exemptions for this standard, and that if your building meets an exemption, you don't have to comply with any of the requirements. Your work is done. Is that right?
Sort of. So if you meet the criteria for one of the exemptions, you don't have to do many of the requirements, but you still have to apply in order to be exempt, and they call it compliance by exemption. I'm sure that's what you meant.
Yes, that's definitely what I meant. There's no way, of course, that I would forget something so important.
That's right.
Thank you for clarifying. All right. Well, with that, I think everyone watching this recording is probably already on track to achieve compliance and won't have to worry about those penalties since they're getting all up to speed today. And hopefully they'll remember that they need to submit a form for exemptions, not like me. Okay, so let's look at the compliance deadlines for each tier. First, we have the largest tier 1 buildings. They must comply by 2028. All tier 2 buildings must also comply by 2028. And those mid-sized tier 1 have the deadline in 2029. And those smallest tier 1 buildings must comply by 2030. Now, these are the compliance deadlines, but there are actions that may need to be taken in advance of that deadline in order to achieve compliance. For example, applications for conditional compliance must be submitted 180 days before a deadline. Or the O&M program has to be in place 12 months before the deadline. So consider this deadline more of a work back date versus a action date. Some other dates that you will want to be aware of are related to early compliance incentives. So at the time of this recording, ODO is finalizing the early adopter incentive program. But we know that it will be a competitive application process. It won't be first come, first serve. And the first application window for those incentives is going to open in August of 2025. That's actually a typo on this slide. We'll have to fix that. And then what's proposed is a dollar per square foot incentive for specific BPS related activities. For example, benchmarking, energy audits, or developing your O&M program. It's not a project-based incentive for specific energy efficiency upgrades. And those incentives must be, or activities must be completed 1 year before your compliance deadline in order to be eligible for incentives. Our friends at the Oregon Department of Energy are actually going to be delivering content on the finalized rules at our webinar on August 6th. And those slides will be made available to SEM participants. So be sure to check for those after this recording. Some other dates to be aware of are related to Tier 2 rulemaking. So Oregon Department of Energy was directed by House Bill 3409 to provide a recommendation for rulemaking related to Tier 2 buildings in 2030. Basically, what this means is that the requirements for Tier 2 buildings may become more strict in 2030, and ODO convened an advisory committee to inform how those recommendations will be developed. So if you are an owner of a Tier 2 building and you want to have a say in how those recommendations are developed, you can join that committee and provide your insight. Just check it out on the ODO webpage. Once you determine your compliance deadline, it's a good idea to think through a work back schedule. We recommend that Tier 1 buildings begin preparing 24 months before their deadline. This timeline will allow you to meet full compliance and or apply for early compliance incentives because you'll have 12 months to implement new energy efficiency measures, 12 months to monitor your EUI after those measures are implemented. Also remember that O&M program must be in place for 12 months before your deadline, and those early compliance incentive actions like developing your O&M program, benchmarking, or getting an energy audit must be done 12 months before your deadline as well. Your timing may be modified depending on the pathway you pursue, whether you're applying for conditional compliance or following the investment criteria. So it's important to just evaluate your own specific situation. And even if you expect to meet the EUI, advanced planning will give you time to maximize incentives. At the very bare minimum, buildings should begin planning over a year before their deadline and get their O&M program in place immediately. There is a 5-year resubmission cycle for Tier 1 buildings, and annual reporting may be required depending on the compliance pathway, specifically if buildings are following the investment criteria pathway. Tier 2 buildings have a little bit more leniency, but should begin planning at least 15 months before your deadline if you're pursuing incentives so that you can submit benchmarking actions 12 months prior to the deadline. At the very bare minimum, you should begin planning 3 months before your deadline. There is a 5-year resubmission cycle for Tier 2 buildings as well. That's what we got for workback schedule. Okay, Kevin, hit me with another takeaway from this timeline section.
Okay, my takeaway is that Tier 2 buildings don't have to do anything until the legislature figures out what they're going to do in 2030.
So while we do expect that the requirements for Tier 2 buildings may become more strict in 2030, there's a lot they still need to do in order to achieve compliance before then. The compliance deadline for Tier 2 buildings is in 2028, and they are required to benchmark, which if they want to get incentives for that, they're actually going to have to do in 2027. So while you remember that 2030 date correctly, there's a little bit more to it. So it's good to start planning early.
Partial credit?
Sure. How about we'll give you a C+.
Thanks.
All right. You want to tell us about benchmarking?
Sure. Okay, so as Grace said earlier, benchmarking is about figuring out how much energy your building is using and comparing it either to the same building historically or to other buildings of similar use. So determining your energy use intensity and benchmarking are relatively synonymous. And we see the energy use intensity on the box there on the top right, kBTU per square foot per year. If you look down below that box, total annual energy consumption, the units of that are thousands of BTUs. So that's where the BTU comes from. But we want to normalize the energy use of a building by the size of the building, because the bigger the building, obviously, the more energy we expect it to use. So we divide by area, and you'll see in the middle bottom the gross floor area of the building. Take your total energy use, gas and electric combined, in units of kilo BTUs, divide by the square footage, and we get the EUI. If we look at the box on the top right, the building performance standard requires that we're using a weather normalized EUI, and that is a feature of Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but it's not automatic. So we need to be careful that we're looking at the right number there. And the standard also says that on-site renewable energy is a good thing. It will help you and it will reduce the non-renewable energy use, which is really what this standard is looking at. And if you have electric vehicle charging, that's not going to count against you either. You can subtract that out. Okay. So there's a lot of training to understand Energy Star Portfolio Manager and to how to get your building's information in there. There's recordings, there's guidance documents. So here's just a snapshot, a look at one of the web pages for Energy Star regarding training. So in order to figure out what our energy use intensity target is for a specific building, that's what we're going to talk about next here. This is a table from the standard. It's the activity site targets, or what I sometimes think of as the nominal EUIT. So if we look at this table on the two columns on the left, not the far left with the numbers, but it gives us our building type. So you'll see at the very top there, banking. If we have a bank branch, and then we look over to the right, the two columns to the right, we've got two different numbers, 53 and 55. Why two different numbers? Well, in Oregon, we have two different climate zones. It's more mild west of the Cascades, and that's climate zone 4C. Weather's a little more extreme to the east of the Cascades, climate zone 5B. So the target or threshold is a little bit higher, 55 instead of 53, if your building is located east of the Cascades. That's how this table works. Something else that factors into, and we'll see how shortly, the calculation of your target energy use intensity is what we call the shift factor. It's how many hours a week you're operating the building. And it's divided up, a line for each different building activity type. And then the three columns on the right is where we're going to focus, the weekly hours. So if you're operating your building 168 hours a week, which, if I'm thinking right, is basically 24/7. Then you choose the number for that category. Anywhere from 51 hours per week to 167, you got a different number there. And then if you're operating less than 50 hours a week, you choose from that column. The way that we use these numbers is, so if your building has a single activity type, it's all used as a bank branch. Then the calculation is relatively straightforward. Here's how it goes. Your energy use intensity target equals the activity site energy target. And that was the first table that we looked at, table 7.2a. The shift factor, that second table we looked at, table 7.3, we just multiply those two numbers. So let's look at an example. We have a 70,000 square foot professional office building in Bend, operating 66 hours per week. So do we need all that information? So Bend is important because it locates the building, and climate zone factors into that. You'll remember me saying that. And the 66 hours per week is going to be needed to give us the shift factor. If we look in that table 7.2a for activity site energy target for a professional office building, we will find for climate zone 5B, the second column, it'd be 52. The shift factor, so we got operating 66 hours per week, that falls between 51 and 167 hours. So it'd be that middle of the last three columns in the shift factor table. And the number for that's a 1. We multiply those two numbers together, and our energy use intensity target for this particular single use building in Bend, Oregon is 52. Not all buildings are single use. Things get a little more complicated. So if you have a building that has multiple activities, it's a mixed use building. That is covered in a subsequent webinar, and the slide deck for that will be available, and we'll go into more depth there. Oregon Department of Energy is developing, so the time of this recording is July 31st, 2025. ODO is currently developing an energy use intensity calculator tool. They expect or hope to have that completed by the end of this summer, that you can plug in your activity types, square footages, et cetera, and it will help you to do the calculations. Group buildings. So buildings that don't have their own metering, there's provisions for that, and there's two main options for handling those, and we'll be going into more depth on this topic too in a subsequent webinar. So if you have a building that shares metering with another building, one way to address it is to install sub-metering. It's nice to have that information to be able to understand just where your energy is used. Obviously, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. There's some initial cost, and you've got to be able to manage that data ongoing. So it does take a significant amount of planning and attention to detail to do it well, but it's a good option. The other main option for complying with the building performance standard is you can, if you don't have independent metering, there's provisions for being able to address multiple buildings as a single entity or group. To do that, it involves determining the tier and activity type of each of the buildings in the group. You want to keep your groups as small as possible, which will obviously be dependent upon how your metering is set up. And then you'll use a weighted average, an area weighted average to calculate your EUIT. And you'll, even if you have buildings with multiple activity types, we kind of simplify it there. And whatever the primary activity type for a building is, we just think of the whole building as being of that type. Again, more on this in a subsequent webinar. Okay, and with that, Grace, what was a takeaway from that section for you?
I think my takeaway is that all buildings can find their energy target by looking it up in a table in the standard. Is that right?
That is where you start, but that's not where you end. You've got to look at two different tables at least, and that's if your building is single use. But those are the two primary tables. So you were headed in the right direction.
Shoot. Okay. I'll try to pay better attention in your next section.
Please do.
All right. Well, I'm going to take these folks through some of the key roles that are required to comply with the Oregon Building Performance Standard. There are 3 qualified energy professionals defined in the standard that you should be aware of as you're pursuing compliance. And they are the qualified energy manager, qualified person, and qualified energy auditor. The QEM is the primary role for Tier 2 buildings, while the qualified person is the primary role for Tier 1 buildings. The qualified energy auditor is required for tier one buildings that need an audit. And these roles can be in-house or contracted. They can also be the same person. If you have buildings in both tiers, you may have one qualified person that also serves as your qualified energy manager for your tier two buildings. As we'll see in a moment, qualified persons automatically meet the minimum requirements for a qualified energy manager, and the same is true for a qualified energy auditor. The qualified person is the primary reporting role for tier one buildings. This person will submit most forms and will calculate the EUI for tier one buildings. This person must be assigned and listed on your compliance application, and they have to meet one of the following criteria on this slide. So I'm not going to read through every single certification on here, but I will highlight that one of the qualifying certifications is the building operator certification level 2. If you're an SCM participant, hopefully you're aware that Energy Trust provides incentives for building operator certification training. And at the time of this recording, there is a building operator certification training launching in the fall. So that could be a really great opportunity to get a member of your team trained in order to serve as a qualified person. The qualified energy manager is the primary reporting role for tier two buildings. This person will also submit most forms and calculate the EUI for tier two buildings. Oops. This person must be assigned and listed on your compliance application, and they also have to meet one of the criteria in this box. So the criteria is at least 2 years of experience with commercial building operations and building energy management, or meet the definition of a qualified person. The state of Washington has very similar roles for their CBPS, and they require a state-funded training for qualified energy managers. Oregon Department of Energy has not indicated that they will have the same training here, but it's something that they could potentially add in the future. So that's something to be aware of if you are planning to be a qualified energy manager as well. All right, last we have a qualified energy auditor. This is required for tier one buildings that have an energy use intensity that is over target at time of compliance, or buildings that don't have a target. And most notably, that would be data centers and power stations. So qualified energy auditors are responsible for conducting the energy audit that is required for these buildings, including a decarbonization assessment, may also include a life cycle cost assessment if the building owner pursues that route. To be a QEA, you have to have 3 years of experience in energy auditing and one of the certifications listed in this blue box here. In order to find these qualified professionals, you'll really want to start thinking about this now. You can either train an internal staff person to fill these roles, look around and see if you have someone that meets those years of experience requirement. Maybe all they're missing is a certification. You can get them trained up. Or you can hire someone to perform this work. The Oregon Department of Energy plans to release a directory of unendorsed qualified persons and qualified energy auditors. So that will be a really great resource. In the meantime, you can review the Association of Energy Engineers Certified Professional Directory. They hold a couple of the certifications that are on the list for a qualified person or qualified energy auditor. And yeah, one thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about how to staff up this position is that if you do keep this person in-house, either hire someone or train someone, you'll be able to retain all of that knowledge about your buildings and optimal energy management in-house so that you can, maintain your buildings as best as possible. So that's something to keep in mind too. Okay, before I pass it to Kevin to share some resources that we've put together, do you want to hit me with one last takeaway, Kevin?
Sure. So if you meet the qualifications for a qualified energy auditor, or if you have a Q anywhere in your first or last name, you can do any of the required tasks. Is that right?
Well, the qualified energy auditor can do any of the required tasks, but you lost me there with the Qs. I know I've been saying a lot of Q words, but our friends with Qs are not necessarily qualified, even if their name is qualified Kevin or qualified Grace.
Okay.
All righty. You want to tell these folks about some of the resources that are available to them?
Yeah, let's do it. So the main resource we want to point you to is the first one listed, the Oregon Department of Energy BPS website. It has an increasing number of guidance documents and other information related to the BPS. They're continuing to add information, so that's your go-to place. And you'll see the subpoint there. There's a way to subscribe for email updates, which we encourage you to do so that when ODO does add significant additional information or there's new information that's coming out, that they will email it to you. The Oregon BPS document. So this is the official document that is the standard that has the rules, the revision of ASHRAE Standard 100. There's a link to it for you to download it there. And then Energy Star Portfolio Manager, two different resources. One's a 13-minute video on benchmarking for ordinances. So it at least gets you started with how to use Portfolio Manager, how to get your information in there. And then you see there's a PDF document listed under that that you can review that gives similar information. The Oregon BPS EUIT calculator is expected late this summer. And then the BPS compliance tracker. So this is a spreadsheet. Grace, are we prepared to show this? Or is that something I could come back to momentarily, maybe? Okay.
Yeah, let's circle back in a couple minutes here.
Okay. So the last one listed the slides from the 2025 SEM BPS webinar series. This is the content from the first of those 4 webinars, and we'll have slide decks from the content of the next 3 webinars that are available, and that should give you some good information there also. So those are our primary resources. And the tracker is a spreadsheet that we developed. Here it is. Thank you, Grace. Actually, I shouldn't say we, it was Grace that basically developed this for you to indicate your buildings. And this is an aid to help you to understand, to determine what tier the buildings fall in, what the compliance state is. There's drop down cells in a number of the columns. It'll determine what the tier is, what the compliance state is, and then on a different tab, it'll step you through and show you what the primary requirements are and give you a place to check off what you've done of the primary requirements for each of tier 1 and tier 2. We just saw tier 1 and now we're on tier 2. And then there's some guidance on mixed use buildings and some resource links there as well. So if you don't already have this compliance tracker, you can ask your energy coach who can provide that to you. So that's our resources. To just recap quickly, we did an overview, high-level overview of the building performance standards. We looked at some key compliance requirements and dates. We looked at resources that can help you with next steps. And we appreciate you joining us for the webinar. Any final words from you, Grace?
Nope. Yeah, looking forward to digging into this more with folks, and feel free to reach out with questions.
Have a good day.